Hello, I'm Earl Airy with Victory Leadership. One of the things that I get asked quite often with some of the people I interact with and some of my clients are organizational change. How do we get change to move, flow? And one of the elements that I always inquire about are what are some of the elements and how well do you know your people? So culture can make a big impact when it comes to change. And a lot of the culture that people can identify with are people who are in different countries where we're separated by geographical boundaries. And those cultures can seem different. However, if we understand some of these cultures just a little bit better, then we can translate some of that learning into our own culture. One of the books that I think is a real great primer on cultures is a book by Dr. David Livermore, which is Expanding Your Boundaries. And within that, he goes through quite a few different elements that make the differences from one culture to the next. And if we take a look at some of these, we can see where there are some opportunities for us to understand and identify with the cultures that are in our own environment. So one of the first elements that he discussed are individualism and collectivism. With individualism, the individual goals are more important than creating or developing personal relationships. And then on the collectivism side, where personal relationships benefiting the group are what's really important over individual goals. Then the next element is power distance. So you can have a low power distance or high power distance, and the low distance is where status is not very important. So people are empowered across all levels of the organization and can contribute to efforts. So it's not very uncommon to see somebody who might be lower in the organization that may interact with somebody who is at a higher level. On the opposite side of that, when you have a high power distance, then you have this gap where there are multiple levels that do not interact or allow information or interaction to flow. And it goes through a very dedicated chain of command. And in those cases, the power distance does not allow for certain elements to transpose. You almost have to create what John Kotter mentions as a dual operating system, where you actually pluck certain individuals out and put them together collectively so that they can transcend some of those boundaries. The next element that David Livermore speaks of is the uncertainty avoidance. And you can have a low or you can have a high uncertainty avoidance. And when it's low, there is a flexibility and a comfortableness with having situations that are unpredictable. Things change rapidly, and people are comfortable with the ambiguity that may exist within the environment. And a high level means that there is a focus on plans and procedure, that the definitions for moving forward and planning is tightly structured so that that ambiguity is removed as much as possible. Then the next level, or the next elements, I should say, are cooperative or competitive. Now, if you have a cooperative environment, then the focus is on the high value of relationships and in family. So people value that interaction that they have with one another. And in a competitive environment, not to say that it is not valued. However, in those cases, there is just a little bit more emphasis on personal accomplishments and achievements. The next is time orientation. Now, that can be short term or it can be a long term time orientation. And the short term, when you value the immediate benefits of their actions. So you're thinking more short term in those cases. And whereas the long term, they are willing to make sacrifices in the short term for strategical long term gains. And they may not seem to focus on the here and now, but what's going to come down the road, what is more sustainable. And the next level then is context. Now the context can be low or it can be high. And in a low context, this is where direct communication or frank discussions, where words are chosen that remove as much ambiguity as possible, or not mincing words, getting straight to the point. Whereas the high context and indirect communications leads to more indirect, and the emphasis is more on harmony, not becoming too blunt or too frank, where it may seem rude or adversarial, but a little bit more laid back and a little more friendly. Not to say that direct people are not friendly, but there's a little more room for ambiguity in some of those cases. And then the last that he mentions is the being or the doing. And being, social, and task commitments, they're equally important. So there's going to be this blurred line between the work-life balance, where one may overlap into the other. In some cultures, this is very prevalent, and others not so much. And in some areas, you'll find a bit of a blending. Whereas the doing aspect, it's more task important, more task oriented, and it exceeds social commitments. So in this case, there is a clear boundary that is created to separate work and life, and neither shall the twain shall meet. So how does this help when it comes to change management? Now, awareness of culture variety in any environment can raise awareness of cultural, and again, in any environment. Just the understanding that there's a culture and there's a difference, that these people have different hopes, dreams, goals, aspirations, values, structures, and things of that nature can help lend some insight into what they value in those areas. And some culture aspects within an organization may be salespeople, information technology workers, accountants, clerical staff, assembly or production line workers. They're all going to have certain things that make them who they are, in addition to their job description and function. These groups have more unique cultures that affect how they view and where they operate. You can have people who are engineers that think different and behave differently than people who are in the office pool. And that's normal within an organization. And when approaching change, considering both of their actions that they perform throughout a normal day in the company can lend insight into what are the elements of change and how is it going to affect them. Not all change is going to affect all departments, but if it's organization-wide, it quite possibly could. So, one of the things that I like to do is quote and create an analogy so it helps the understanding of the point that's being made. And one of the greatest quotes that I've heard was Anais Nin, who said, "We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are." So we take a look through the world through our lenses, and when doing so, we may miss the opportunity of seeing how someone else views something that we may have not considered. So taking a moment to see the environment through the lens of another can definitely help give us insight into what they're thinking about. And if you don't know, ask. Some people say that they don't ask, or some people are hesitant to ask. They don't ask because they may see it as a show of weakness by not having knowledge within a particular area. Well, ignorance is just plain ignorance, and not trying to educate oneself, I think, is an exercise in ignorance. Making inquiries to understand other people better shows that you have an interest in them. And when there is a genuine desire to get to know the other person, then people will pick up on this. Those questions, those asks, those inquisitions will show interest that when you're genuine, they'll pick up. And when you're not genuine, if you're just trying to get information, it'll show. There are muscle groups in the human face that is capable of upwards of 4,000 different types of expressions. There could be just a smile, or there could be a genuine smile, and the different muscles will coordinate with your emotional state and express how you're feeling. That's why the language is only roughly about 17% of our total ability to communicate. So much is in inflection and tone and body language that when we speak with one another, we may not speak multiple words, but we speak volumes. So, and why this is important, if you haven't already discovered, is that when we want to move change forward, it's helpful to know these values, who has these values, what they value, and why they value that. And understanding change, the change targets, the people who you're asking to make the change. You can identify with the objections and the corrections that they may have. There may be a misunderstanding about what that change is. And by giving credence and a deeper understanding of those elements that make up that culture, then you can integrate that into the planning stages. And when people know one another, they tend to be less adversarial. Quick story about two men who led two great armies, went to war, and they fought all day and late into the night. And in the end, everyone was vanquished except for the two victors, one on either side. And the one says to the other, I'm getting kind of tired. Why don't we wrap this up and start again in the morning? And the other one says, okay, I'm fine with that. And they make their campfire. They're not far from one another. And then one of them, just kind of says, hey, I have a son, and he's back home, but he's going to grow up, and hopefully he'll be, like his old man and following my footsteps. And then the other, says, I've got a son and a daughter, and the son, I'd like to follow after me, and my daughter, she is beautiful. She's a spitting image of my beautiful wife. And so they chatter back and forth, and they don't get any sleep. They talk off and on throughout the night. And then they get up in the morning when the sun rises, and they raise their shield and they raise their sword. And they look at one another, take their sword, they sheath it, they both turn around and go home. And the whole moral of that story is it's hard to be adversarial with somebody that you have created a relationship with. So when we learn to have constructive disagreements and we're finding it difficult to find anything to agree on, try to agree on something, anything, even if it's about a restaurant down the street that you may have both went to, or a color or something. It gives each one the impression that there is that you're pliable, that you're not so rigid that you can't listen or agree with anything. And then you start to tell your stories and get to know one another. And when that adversarial facade starts to diminish, then hopefully that can lead to some trust and interaction, to where we're in this together. We both want a positive conclusion. Let's work on it and come up with a solution that will help carry this forward into a sustainable, prosperous environment. Thank you.